Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah,
Today we're tackling something I think a lot of us struggle with, and that's fear and anxiety.
hey,
And we're looking at it through the lens of faith. Specifically, one Bible verse,
mm,
1 John 4:18-19.
interesting.
Our source material is a YouTube video
Okay.
by Mark D. Jesus
Yeah.
called The One Scripture That Saved My Mental Health.
I see.
And we're going to unpack D. Jesus' personal insights and how this one verse could be helpful for you too.
I think what's really cool about this is that it's not just like some abstract theological debate.
Right.
We're actually looking at how this verse played out in someone's like actual life and struggles.
Exactly. Jesus isn't just preaching, he's speaking from experience. So
Right.
let's get to the verse itself. 1 John 4:18-19 says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, where do we even begin with that?
Yeah. Well, this passage really tackles this idea of a God of fear, which I think a lot of people struggle with.
Mhm.
This idea that God is kind of like out to get us, or that he's waiting for us to mess up so he can punish us.
Right.
But Jesus makes the point that God doesn't use this kind of like crippling fear to get our attention.
Mhm.
It's not his style. And actually, this lines up with another verse, 2 Timothy 1:7, which says that God hasn't given us a spirit of fear.
That's a good point, because if these overwhelming feelings of fear and anxiety aren't coming from God, then where are they coming from?
Right. That's the question. Like, what's the source?
Yeah, and Jesus suggests that fear, and he's using this broadly to cover anxiety, worry, panic, even things like paranoia, is actually working against us.
Okay.
Like, fear is this tool that's being used to steal our peace
Hmm.
rather than something from God urging us toward, safety or righteousness.
Oh, so I can see how that would be like a comforting thought for someone struggling with anxiety.
Like, it's not that they're doing something wrong to deserve this fear.
Yeah.
Instead, maybe it's about recognizing that fear itself can be a distortion, something to be addressed rather than obeyed.
I think that's a really helpful way to think about it.
Yeah.
So if fear is the tool, then what's the antidote?
Right.
Jesus believes it's the experience of God's perfect love. He
Mhm.
even compares it to Jesus casting out demons.
Yeah.
Perfect love casts out fear.
Wow.
So the more we experience God's love, the less power fear has over us.
That's a really powerful image.
Hmm.
This idea of this love that's strong enough to drive out something as intense as fear.
Yeah.
It makes me think about how some people describe feeling safe or held when they connect with their faith. Maybe that's part of what this verse is getting at.
Yeah.
That feeling of security that can come from experiencing this kind of love.
I think that's a great insight. It's not just about intellectually understanding the concept of God's love,
Right.
but about having a tangible felt experience of it. And that experience can be a source of tremendous strength and resilience in the face of fear.
So how does Jesus himself fit into all of this?
Yeah.
Didn't he mention struggling with anxiety himself?
He did, yes. He actually opens up about his own struggles with anxiety in the video.
Mm.
And initially, he thought his anxiety stemmed from a punishment-based relationship with God, almost as if he was constantly worried about being judged for his actions.
That punishment-based idea.
Yeah.
Like, some people were raised with the belief that if they don't follow the rules perfectly, there will be consequences. And it's easy to see how that mindset could lead to anxiety, always feeling like you're walking on eggshells.
I absolutely can.
Yeah.
And what Jesus realized was that this kind of fear wasn't bringing him closer to God.
Right.
It was creating a barrier.
Mm.
As he started to experience God's love more deeply,
Yeah.
he realized that anxiety was a sign he needed more of that love, not less.
So it wasn't about trying to earn God's love or avoid punishment,
Right.
but about recognizing that he was already loved unconditionally.
Exactly.
And within that love, there was a sense of peace and freedom that could help him overcome his anxieties.
That's precisely it. And he has this really powerful line.
Mm.
He who fears has not been made perfect in love.
Whoa.
It really challenges the way a lot of us approach faith,
Yeah.
It's not about striving for perfection through good deeds, but about allowing ourselves to be transformed by love.
And this love isn't something we have to earn, right?
Mhm.
Jesus emphasizes that God loved us first before we even tried to love him.
Right.
So the starting point isn't about how perfectly we love God, but about opening ourselves up to receive his love for us.
Yes, and this is where it starts to get really practical because Jesus doesn't just leave us with these beautiful ideas about love. He actually gives us some tangible steps we can take to experience this love more fully in our own lives.
Okay.
He talks about things like understanding God as a loving father, addressing our own personal rejection wounds, and learning to love ourselves through the lens of God's love.
So it sounds like he's providing a roadmap for how we can actually move from a place of fear to a place of love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about feeling better. It's about changing the core way we relate to ourselves, to God, and even to the challenges we face.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Jesus' message so powerful. It's both comforting and empowering,
Right.
offering a path forward for anyone who's ever felt trapped by fear or anxiety.
So we've talked about this idea of God's perfect love driving out fear and to Jesus' own journey with anxiety.
Mm.
But how does someone who's maybe skeptical of all this or who doesn't necessarily believe in the same way connect with this message? Is there something universal here?
That's a great question, and I think there absolutely is.
Okay.
Because even if you remove the specifically religious language, the underlying principles are incredibly relatable.
Yeah.
We all experience fear. We all crave love and connection. We
Yeah.
all long for a sense of peace and security.
So even if someone doesn't necessarily view it through the lens of a relationship with God, the idea of choosing love over fear, of recognizing that fear can be a distorting influence,
Mm.
and of actively seeking out experiences that cultivate love and connection, those are all things that can be incredibly beneficial for anyone, regardless of their beliefs.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this conversation so valuable.
Yeah.
Because it's not about imposing a specific belief system. It's about exploring universal human experiences and finding tools that can help us navigate those experiences in a healthier, more fulfilling way.
I love that. So we've got this idea of perfect love as the antidote to fear, some really practical steps we can take to experience that love,
Right.
and even a way to connect with the message on a more universal level.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we go from here? What else did Jesus have to say about all this?
Well, he goes on to talk about the source of anxiety, and really digs into this idea of a punishment-based relationship with God. I think a lot of us can relate to that,
Definitely.
even if we haven't articulated it in those exact words.
Yeah, it's like that feeling of if I mess up, I'm going to be punished,
Yeah.
which can create a lot of anxiety.
Exactly. And what Daisy suggests is that this fear of punishment can actually block us from experiencing the fullness of God's love.
Mm.
Instead of approaching God with a sense of openness and trust, we're constantly worried about making mistakes and facing consequences.
So it's almost like we create this wall between ourselves and God out of fear.
Yeah,
And that wall
yeah,
prevents us from receiving the love that's already there.
precisely. And when we're operating from that place of fear, it's easy to misinterpret our experiences.
Oh.
We might see challenges or setbacks as evidence that God is angry with us or that we're being punished for something.
Right.
But Dejus challenges us to view those experiences through a different lens, the lens of love.
So instead of asking, what did I do wrong?
Right.
We might ask, what is this experience teaching me about God's love? That's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
It is, and it requires us to really lean into the idea that God's love is unconditional. It's not something we earn or lose based on our behavior. It's a constant, unwavering presence in our lives.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier to Jesus' comparison of perfect love casting out fear, like Jesus casting out demons.
Yeah.
It's such a vivid image. But how does that actually work in practice? How do we experience this casting out of fear in our own lives?
I think it starts with recognizing the presence of fear and naming it.
Okay.
What are the specific fears that are holding you back? What are the anxieties that are stealing your peace?
Right.
Once we've identified those fears, we can start to invite God's love into those spaces.
So it's not about ignoring the fear or pretending it's not there.
Right.
It's about acknowledging it and then consciously choosing to focus on love instead.
Exactly. And this is where the practical steps that Dejus outlines become so important.
Okay.
He talks about understanding God as a loving father, addressing our rejection wounds, learning to love ourselves through the lens of God's love. These are all practices that can help us cultivate a deeper experience of God's love, which then has the power to displace fear.
It sounds like these practices are about shifting our internal landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of focusing on what we're doing wrong or what we need to fix, we're intentionally cultivating an inner environment of love and acceptance.
Yes, and that shift in our internal landscape can have a profound impact on how we experience the world around us.
Okay.
When we're grounded in a sense of God's love, we're less likely to be shaken by external circumstances. We can face challenges with a sense of peace and resilience, knowing that we're not alone.
That brings up an interesting question. How might this idea of experiencing God's love as an antidote to fear resonate with someone who doesn't necessarily identify with the Christian faith?
Right.
Is there a way to translate this concept for a broader audience?
That's a really thoughtful question, and I think the answer is yes.
Okay.
There are definitely universal elements here.
Yeah.
Regardless of one's specific beliefs, the idea of love as a powerful force that can heal and transform is something that resonates across cultures and traditions.
So even if we strip away the religious language, we're left with this core principle: love can help us overcome fear.
Exactly.
And that's something that everyone can relate to.
Right, we all experience fear, whether it's fear of failure, fear of rejection, or fear of the unknown. And we all long for love and connection.
Right.
So even if someone doesn't believe in God or doesn't resonate with the Christian framework, they can still connect with the idea that choosing love over fear can be a powerful force for healing and growth.
It's like DeGenesis is offering a specific pathway for experiencing this transformative power of love. But the destination itself, that sense of peace, freedom, and resilience that comes from choosing love over fear,
Yeah.
is something that's universally accessible.
That's beautifully said, and I think it highlights the importance of being open to different perspectives and approaches.
Yeah.
Even if we don't fully agree with every detail,
Right.
there's often something valuable we can learn from each other's experiences.
Absolutely. So we've explored this idea of perfect love, casting out fear, to Jesus' personal journey with anxiety, and even how this message might resonate with people from different belief systems. What stood out to you the most from all of this? What really resonated with you personally?
Honestly, what resonated most with me was Jesus' vulnerability in sharing his own struggle with anxiety.
Yeah.
You know, it's easy to talk about these concepts in a theoretical way,
Right.
but hearing someone openly discuss their personal experience makes it so much more relatable and authentic.
I agree. It's like he's saying, look, I've been there. I've wrestled with these same fears and anxieties, but I found a way through, and I want to share that with you. That kind of authenticity is so powerful.
It is, and it reminds us that none of us are alone in our struggles.
Right.
No matter how isolated or overwhelmed we might feel,
Yeah.
there's always hope. And sometimes that hope comes in the form of someone sharing their story and reminding us that there's a way forward.
That's a beautiful thought. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the source of anxiety, the power of perfect love, practical steps for experiencing that love, and even the universal appeal of choosing love over fear. What's next? Where does Jesus take us from here?
Well, he wraps up by giving some really practical advice and resources, which I thought was super helpful. You know, he doesn't just leave us with these big ideas about love conquering fear. He actually offers some tools and strategies to put these ideas into practice.
Right. What I appreciated was that he emphasizes it's not about achieving some perfect state of love or never feeling fear again.
Right.
It's about shifting our orientation, recognizing that fear is often a signal that we need to tap into a deeper experience of God's love.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, okay, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling afraid. That's not a sign of failure. It's an invitation to lean into love. And then he gives us some concrete ways to do that. Like, what were some of those resources he mentioned?
Well, he talks about exploring the idea of God as a loving father, which can be really powerful for people who might have had difficult relationships with their own earthly fathers. You know, it's about reframing our understanding of what a father figure can be and recognizing that God's love is completely different from any human experience of love.
That makes me think about how some people might view God as this distant, judgmental figure.
Right.
And if that's your starting point, it's easy to see how fear would dominate the relationship.
Yeah.
But if you can start to see God as a source of unconditional love and support,
Yeah.
that can completely change how you approach everything.
Absolutely. And he also talks about the importance of addressing rejection wounds. You know, so many of us carry around these deep-seated fears of not being good enough, not being lovable, not being worthy. And those fears can really fuel our anxieties and keep us trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and fear.
It's like those fears become this lens through which we view everything.
Yeah.
And if we can start to heal those wounds, it's like we're cleaning the lens, allowing us to see ourselves and the world more clearly.
That's a great analogy. And finally, DeJesus emphasizes the importance of learning to love ourselves through the lens of God's love. It's about recognizing our inherent worth and value, not because of what we do or achieve, but simply because we are beloved creations of God.
This is where it all comes full circle, doesn't it?
It does.
Because if we can truly embrace that we are loved unconditionally, then fear loses its grip. We don't have to be perfect. We don't have to earn love. We simply have to receive it.
And that's a powerful message, especially for anyone who's struggling with anxiety or fear. It's a reminder that we are not defined by our fears. We are defined by the love that is woven into the very fabric of our being.
So if we're trying to distill all of this down into something actionable for our listeners,
Yeah.
what would be the key takeaway? What's the one thing we want them to remember from this deep dive?
I think the biggest takeaway is this. If fear is a sign that we need more love, then the antidote to fear is to actively seek out and experience God's love in a deeper way.
Mm-hmm.
And DeJason has given us some really practical starting points for doing just that.
So it's not about white-knuckling our way through fear.
Right.
It's about recognizing that fear itself is an invitation to lean into something bigger, something more powerful, and that something, according to Jesus, is the unconditional love of God.
Beautifully put. And even for those who might not resonate with the theological language, the principle itself is universal. We all need love, we all crave connection, and we all have the capacity to choose love over fear.
So as you go about your week, dear listeners, I encourage you to consider, where in your life might you need to experience God's love more deeply? What are those areas where fear is holding you back, where anxiety is stealing your peace?
And remember, you don't have to do this alone.
Yeah.
Jesus has offered some amazing resources for exploring the idea of God as a loving father, addressing rejection wounds, and learning to love yourself through the lens of God's love. Check out those resources, dive deeper into these practices, and see what unfolds.
You might be surprised at how much freedom and joy you discover on the other side of fear. Until next time, keep diving deep.